Well, welcome back to the Occupational Health and Safety tutorial. We're in Module 5 and we're about to start Unit 2. This module is about physical and psychological health. The first thing we're going to look at is radiation, and we're going to split radiation into two types, ionizing and non-ionizing. So now with ionizing. Ionizing is high energy from radioactive material, and it's bits of the atoms coming off. So the atoms are changed because bits are coming off them. So with alpha particles, it's 2 protons and 2 neutrons coming off, and it's a little bit of power is what we need to know, a bit of power coming off, and we can stop it, because it's not much power, with a piece of paper. Although we can still ingest, we can still eat the particles. Beta particles are electrons or positrons, and again you can inhale them or eat them, so they can come in that way. Gamma rays are all together, and X-rays are more powerful, higher energy, and they can actually pass through our bodies. And we're familiar with this from X-rays. You might have had a tooth X-ray or a chest X-ray for a medical, and they take a picture of you against the screen, and they see your bones, which stops some of the gamma rays and X-rays, but the rest go through you and don't show up. The last one we're going to talk about is radon. Radon is a naturally occurring gas, but it comes from the radioactive decay of rocks. Now we have something similar in Oman, which we call norm, naturally occurring radioactive material. And norm we might find through drilling, and it will come up through the ground. But radon gas emerges from the rocks in some places. These rocks are slowly emitting radon gas, and the radon gas is heavier than air. So it can accumulate in low places, like in a basement or in a manhole. So we need to check before we go into the manhole or before we go into the basement in those areas that the radon gas has been dispersed. We can disperse it through having ventilation, or through providing fans, or providing open windows, things like that. Non-ionizing radiation is heating cells, so it's a heating effect. So for example, if I go outside in the sun in Oman, I can expose my skin to sunlight, and if I just leave my hand in the sun for several hours, it will get sunburnt. The sun will have heated the skin, and the skin will have been damaged. Or another example of ultraviolet light is from electrical arc welding. So someone is welding with electricity, and you see that spark, that very, very bright blue or purple spark that jumps. That is emitting ultraviolet light, and you can get sunburnt from it. So when you look at welders welding, they have screens to protect their eyes from the ultraviolet, and they have gloves to protect their hands from the ultraviolet from sunburn. Another example is infrared. So you've had a barbecue perhaps, and you've seen the coals, and when the coals are ready, they're glowing red or orange hot, and that's emitting infrared heat. And you can put your hand near the coals and you know it's hot. That's infrared heat coming to you, non-ionizing radiation. Lasers are another example of non-ionizing radiation. Lasers stand for light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. But it's a focus using lenses of a source of light, usually. And that concentrated light you've also seen in shops, on the barcode readers, at the checkouts. You might have seen it in construction industry, where they have surveying equipment using lasers. Another example is microwaves. Many of us have microwaves at home for cooking, but we also have microwaves with our mobile phones, very low dose. But our cookers, you think about your microwave cooker, it will only start and emit microwaves after you've shut the door. Why? Because they're protecting you from the emissions. And the last example I'm going to bring is radio frequencies. So we have radios in our cars, for example, or at home. And how does the radio get the signal? From a transmitter. And in Oman, we've seen the transmitters usually on steel towers, and they've got a panel on that looks like a panel on the top, and that's transmitting the radio frequency. And in all those cases, it's a heating action of some sort or another. There's no change at the atomic level, so it's not ionizing, non-ionizing radiation. So what effects? Well, if we think about ionizing radiation for the moment, the industries involved are nuclear industry in general, hospitals in the X-ray department, for example, research establishments where they're doing work on ionizing radiation, in construction, maybe, and in radon gas, which I've mentioned. So these people, or people who work in these industries, are potentially at risk, and they need to be looked after. And we'll talk about how to do that shortly. Effects for occupations for non-ionizing radiation. Construction workers, because are exposed to sunlight, and because they're exposed to sunlight, they're exposed to ultraviolet burns to the skin and eyes, and then to skin cancer. And one particular skin cancer called melanoma is a very aggressive cancer. So if you have spots on your hands that are growing or changing colour or expanding, go and see a doctor today. Don't wait for a week or two. Go and get it treated or get it diagnosed correctly. Welding, construction welding, again, ultraviolet light, and it's causing burn to the skin and damage to the back of the eyes. So people at risk obviously are welders, but also people walking past the welding. And if you've seen somebody welding, your eyes are drawn to this bright light of the welder. So he should have some screens up to protect you. He's got the protection for his eyes with his mask. For lasers, we can think about shopkeepers and people who use lasers for surveying work, and they need to protect their eyes. And we do that with shopkeepers, for example, by having very low dose equipment. And then they also have a scanner where they just pass the product in front of the screen, and that's low dose. And they have a gun, for want of a better way of describing it, and that gun only sends the laser when they pull the trigger. Another example, more common in the UK than Oman, is sun tanning shops. Here the ultraviolet light is used to change the skin colour of people who want to have a darker skin colour. And the people who manage those shops have to do a risk assessment and look at the person, think about their colour, how much exposure they've had before, and then make a decision. How much exposure will I give to this person? How much time will I allow them to sit on my sunbed? Because I obviously don't want to harm them, even though I want their money for the sun tanning. Foundries are where you melt metal and pour it into different shapes. So foundries have the metal red hot, and that's the infrared that I spoke about earlier. So the infrared colour, orange and red, that you see on your coals, you transfer that same heat to metal and it melts, it will give off that same infrared heat. And again, you'll be at risk of burn to your skin or burn to your eyes. Medical workers, they're exposed to lasers and ultraviolet light for different purposes for medical treatments. And then motor vehicle repairs, you can get some types of paint that are quick curing, which is good, but they use ultraviolet light to do the curing. So if you paint that paint onto, say, a car, you then have to treat the paint with the ultraviolet light, and you need to think carefully about where the ultraviolet light will get reflected back to and protect the person who's doing that. So what can we do in general to protect ourselves? Looking at ionizing radiation to start with. The first one is time. We can reduce the time of exposure. That's obviously sensible. So we can say, instead of exposing someone to maybe hours of exposure, we might expose them to minutes, reduce the time. We can increase the distance. The further you are away from something, the less effect it will have on you. And the third defense, if you like, is shielding. Put something between you and the source of radiation. So now let's think of an example. I'm going to go to hospital to have a chest x-ray. So when it's my turn, the x-ray technician lets me into the x-ray room. There's only 2 of us in the room. I stand in front of the screen for my x-ray, and what does the technician do? They set me up, then they reduce the time, because they only they expose the x-ray only for a very short period of time. The technician has moved some distance away, and the technician has moved behind a wall or some other shielding. So the technician is protecting themselves. I'm being exposed to the x-ray because it's only one x-ray every so many years, and so it's a very small dose. But for them, in there all day taking x-rays, they need to be protected. So they protect with time, distance and shielding. We can also, by law, protect. So we, in Oman, have the requirement for risk assessments in MD 286/2008. In the UK, we're required to do risk assessments. So we can do risk assessments, and they have for the X-ray technician, and they've taken the precautions. We can classify different areas. So think about the X-ray technician again. That whole room where the X-ray machine is has been classified as an X-ray area. So only the people who need to be in there are in there. There's no admin people, there's no queuing and waiting. We wait outside the room because they've classified the X-ray room as the place for the X-rays. We can classify workers, so the X-ray technician has been classified as someone who works with radiation, ionizing radiation, and they can be checked and assessed at intervals as well as having the precautions. I'll show you a picture later of dosimetry, which is basically a little device for measuring the amount of radiation that you've received or been exposed to. And then we can monitor the workplace. So we can check, are the people that we have working for us being exposed to more radiation than they should be or not? Another example of control is for radon. Now in the UK we have radon, and it's a gas. So one way to control it is to stop the gas coming as it comes up out of the ground. We want it to get blown away and dispersed. But to stop it coming up and coming into the building, we put a gas-proof membrane under the building. Essentially, this is a polythene sheet, a robust polythene sheet, and we put that down across the whole of the building footprint, and then we pour the concrete, so that any gas that comes out of the ground hits that polythene sheet and cannot come into the building. And then underneath the polythene we'll often put a porous layer of stone or something like that, so the gas can get blown out and away. For basements, we can ventilate them, we can provide air in and air out, or we can put a suction fan in to suck the radon gas out. We can do things like that. And we can also install radon monitoring equipment, so we can measure the amount of radon in the room, and if you come in and see that there's a lot of radon, you can go back out again and then put on the fan to ventilate it away. Here's a picture of 2 dosimeters, and the main thing to see is they're very small. If you look at the safety pin on the blue one, it's quite a small device. It just pins to your clothes, or pins to your jacket, or clips in the case of the lower one, and that measures the amount of radiation that you're getting. And then we can compare that to a standard and know whether you've had too much or too little. Right, for non-ionizing radiation, we can think about our microwave oven, for example. That's an enclosure, so that's shielding. The microwave is in a box, the box has a door, and even the door has got seals. So the microwave is a good example of enclosure. For safe distance, the example I can give is for the radio transmission masts, where they have these masts and the transmitters pointing usually horizontally because they want the signal to travel a long way, but it has the added benefit of keeping the signal away from us. We're separated by distance down to the ground. For For lasers, we can reduce the reflective surfaces. So if you work in a laboratory where they use lasers, you'll find the surfaces are black, but not a shiny black, even it's a matte black, a non-shiny surface. So that reduces the amount of laser light that can be reflected potentially into our eyes. And then we can use PPE. If you remember the hierarchy of control, it was eliminate, separate, engineering controls, admin controls, and then PPE. But we can use PPE. We can have shades, eye shades for lasers. We can have sun hats. You can use sunblock as a cream. These are all things that we can use to protect ourselves when we're exposed to a common source of non-ionizing radiation, like the sun. And again, legislation, we can do risk assessments, and then we can set up, based on the risk assessment, a safe system of work. So our safe system of work may describe the enclosures, or it may describe the safe distance, or the limited amount of time that we're exposed to the non-ionizing radiation. And then we can introduce engineering controls and PPE as required. Moving on then, we'll now talk about mental ill health and stress as one example. I think we've all heard of the word stress, and we all understand it's a big problem globally. And particularly at a time like this when we're exposed to COVID-19 and we are all in different circumstances as a result of this situation. So technically, stress is anything that is where the demands of what you want me to do are outside my capacity to do them. So I feel that, and it's important, it's what I feel as the person who is stressed. I feel it's too much for me to cope. Then I'm stressed by definition. In Japan, they know this disease as karoshi, which means death from overwork. There are 3 levels of control. The first solution and preferred solution is eliminate what's causing the stress. So eliminate the stressor. That would be nice to do, but it's not always practicable. So if you can't eliminate the stressor, the thing causing the stress, the second choice is improve or increase the person's capacity to cope with stress. Perhaps you can train them some more. If they've had some more training, they'll be able to cope with more stress, and therefore they'll feel less stress with what they've got. So that's the first choice, second choice, and the third choice is treat the stress. Obviously, this is the third choice because the person is stressed, they're showing signs of ill health, and you're treating the ill health. So they are stressed, and you haven't reduced it, and you haven't eliminated it. So the third level is treating the stress. So what can cause stress? Well, the first I mentioned is something beyond my capacity to cope. The work may be too much. I can't cope with all this work, it's too much. Or it may be not enough work. And not enough work is also boring, and it's also stressful. Not having enough control. So for instance, if I'm given 5 jobs to do this week by my manager, if she says to me, here are 5 things to do, please try to do them, then I feel I have some control and flexibility. So I might choose to do this task in the morning because it requires a lot of thinking, and I do my best thinking in the morning. And I might choose to do this task in the afternoon because it's a routine task and I don't need to be so mentally alert at the time. But I have some control. If I have no control and someone says to me, do this, and when you've done that, come back and then do this, and when you come back, do this, you'll feel stressed. You'll be micromanaged, we would say. If you are feeling in a stressful situation, then if you have some support, you'll feel better about it. So for example, before there's change at work, or before there's, if there's going to be stress at work because we have a lot of work, if the team leader pulls everybody in and says, for the next 2 weeks we're all going to have to work very hard because we have this work order to complete, then after that, then it'll ease back a bit. We'll all feel that we've got support and help. Or if you feel you can go and talk to your manager and say, I have too much work, or I don't have enough work, then you'll feel better about it, and you'll be supported, and you'll manage the stress better. Another stressor is poor relationships. So poor relationships can manifest themselves with people not talking to you, perhaps, or they can bully you. And that would be examples of poor relationships. And that will be stressful for you. Another example of a stressor is the role. If I don't really know what I'm supposed to be doing, I will feel stressed. If I have no control over what I have to produce, or no influence over what I have to produce, or the way I produce it, I'll feel stressed. The role can be a stressor. Change is a stressor. All change is stressful. And we're all familiar with that, with the changes that have happened with COVID-19. But if at any other time work was changing, or even your home life was changing, then you would be stressed. You can also be stressed because of the physical environment. So if you feel unsafe, you'll feel stressed. Or if it's very hot and humid, you'll feel stressed. Or if the welfare arrangements, the toilet arrangements are very poor and dirty, you won't feel good. Or if there's a threat of violence, if you feel that you might be hit or verbally abused, you'll feel stressed. And the last one to mention is work-home interface. If you're stressed at home, because let's say, for example, your wife has had a new baby, you're going to take that stress and bring it to work. If you're stressed at work because of change at work, you're going to take that stress home. It's very difficult to separate home stress and work stress. So you need to think about your family and your personal lifestyle and try to manage it that way. And manage the work stress as well. So controls. You can go to the www.hse.gov.uk website, which is mentioned there at the top. And that has lots of useful information about stress and many other things as well. But the first step is identify the problem. If you know what the problem is, I was going to say you're halfway there to solving it, but at least you're on the way to solving it. It's not a vague kind of uncertain thing. We know specifically it's this thing, and now we can work on this thing. So we've identified the problem, and then we identify where does this problem come from? How was it discovered? What's the cause of it? If I can find the cause of this problem, then I can work out a remedial action, something I can do to improve the situation. So I might take a remedial action. And I will agree the remedial action with both the person who is stressed and probably with their manager as well. And then we'll set some targets. And the targets will say, we're going to try and do this by this date and that by that date. And then after you've done that, you try it out. Is this solution working? And if it is working, well and good. But you'll set a review date, maybe after a week or after a month or after 2 months. And you can review it and see, is it working for you? It seems to be working for me, and we can discuss it. And maybe then we identify a different problem or a change problem, and we go through those same steps again to solving it. I'll give you an example of this. I was at work for consulting engineers, and one of our engineers was stressed. He was so stressed he had to go home, and he was off work for several weeks. We identified the problem. The problem was, this man was called Richard. So the problem was Richard never said no. He'd always say, yes, I can do it. Yes, I can do it. And he had too much work. So that was the reason for his stress. So we had an action plan. And the action plan was his manager would manage the amount of work Richard did, and no one was to give Richard work without going through his manager. And then Richard had a plan for coming back to work. And the first time he came back to work, all he had to do was come to work, say hello to everybody, and go home. The second week, he came and stayed for 30 minutes or for an hour and went home. And then gradually we increased the amount of time he was in the office, and he built up slowly over a number of weeks till he was working full time again. But his manager was monitoring the amount of work he had, and if Richard started to work overtime, his manager changed the situation and reduced the amount of work he had. And we wanted to keep Richard. He was a very good engineer. So controls. For stress, take a positive attitude to stress issues. If you are the manager and someone comes to you and says, I feel stressed, take it seriously. It's not easy for someone to come up to their manager and say, I feel stressed. So take it seriously. If someone comes to you and says they're sick, you would take it seriously. Do the same with stress. It's another illness. You can develop a confidential counselling system. So separate to the manager and the managerial system, you have a separate system, maybe managed by a third party, and the person who is stressed can go and talk to them for ideas and help, and be encouraged that way. We can develop communication systems so we know how to talk and what's the procedure. So if I feel stressed and it's related to work, I can probably solve it by talking to my manager. But if my manager is the source of the stress, I can't easily talk to my manager. So I need to have another route, maybe through the HR department, to talk about that. And I can give an example of this again from my personal work experience. I worked for a man, his name was John, and everybody in the department was stressed because of John. He was a bully. So because we all reported it, the HR department said, we've got a problem, and the problem is John, it's not his team. And so John was given some training about, in his case, anger management. And that really improved the situation, both for John and for the rest of his team. Well, the stress controls continue with a stress policy. So we'll have a policy. We're going to take stress seriously. We're going to try to minimize stress in our staff. We'll manage people who are feeling stressed. We want you to be looked after and to come to work and enjoy your work and be free from unnecessary stress. We can train our people. If you train them so they're good at their job, they'll feel confident, they'll enjoy their job, and that will help them reduce the stress. We certainly should discourage excess work. I call it presentism, where people are present but not necessarily working effectively. And we want to discourage people from having the whole of their life as work. Remember at the beginning we talked about, for the Japanese term for it was karoshi, death from overwork. We are contracted to work, let's say, 40 hours. So if we're working 45 hours, we're working too much. We can make jobs more interesting and increase variety by rotating jobs. So if you work in a factory and your job is all day to take a screw, screw it in, and wait till the next piece of work comes, take a screw, screw it in, and that's all you do, you are going to be bored, and because you're bored, you're going to be stressed. So they've worked this out in the car industry decades ago, and they put people to work in teams. So it wasn't just one person putting in one screw by himself separate from everybody else. They had a team maybe of 4 or 5, and they did 4 or 5 jobs around the bit of car that they were making. But the beauty of it was that every hour or so they could rotate inside their team, so everybody got variety through the day. And it also meant that people could talk to each other while they were working. Another control is to monitor bullying. So if you think someone is bullying other people, you can either challenge them in a polite way, or you can talk to the people who you think are being bullied and see if they agree. But we need to monitor it, and we have a way to monitor it through the stress policy that we mentioned earlier. And finally, I'd like to say for accidents, avoid a blame culture. If we have a blame culture with accidents, people will hide the evidence. But if we know that we can be open about what we saw and heard and happened, and that the management will take it seriously without blame, then we're more likely to give you the right answer, the right information, and that will be helpful. Right, we'll move on and talk about violence. Violence is an incident in which a person is abused or threatened or assaulted in circumstances related to their work. It can be verbal or it can be physical. Which is more common? Well, the verbal is more common, but it's still damaging. And it can be the violence can be from a third party, from outside the company, or it can be somebody inside the company, a bully, for example. So people who are at risk of violence at work are people who have to deal with the public. So if you deal with the public, you don't know who you're dealing with. It could be anybody. And they could be normal people, they could be violent people, they could be stressed people, but because you're dealing with the public, you have no control of them, and they're more difficult to deal with. You're more at risk. Another group is people who deal with violent people. So imagine if you work as a prison officer. You're dealing potentially with violent people. That will put you more at risk of violence. People who handle money. So, people who handle money are more at risk because people are tempted, or potentially tempted, to steal from them, which will involve violence. And then lone workers. An example of a lone worker might be somebody who gives the parking tickets. You've parked your car in a bad place, and you're issuing and you come back to the car, and someone is writing the ticket. And they're working by themselves. And you might have yourself in the car and 2 or 3 other people. So that one person is potentially at risk from angry car parkers. Controls. Well, there are lots of controls that you can use. You can use organisational controls, or the design of work, and things like that. So let me give you an example. So for London Underground, decades ago, they had a problem. The problem was that on their platforms, the train would come in, the driver would stop, and there's a person at the end of the platform, the back of the train, on the platform, and when he saw that everybody was in, he would raise a flag, the driver would see the flag in his mirror, close the doors, and take the train away. Well, what would happen is this. Imagine I'm running to catch the train. The train's there, the guard sees everybody's in, the guard puts up the flag, and just before I get through the doors close, and I miss the train. And I feel cross and stressed, so I turn to the guard and either verbally or physically abuse them. And London Underground had a problem with people being abused this way. So they changed the organisation and the design of the workplace. And what they did was, at every location there was a guard, they put a CCTV camera. So now whatever happened to the guard was on camera. Second, they put posters up on the trains and on the platforms that said, if you abuse our guards, we will prosecute you. And then they waited. And so the first person who missed his train and abused the guard was caught on the camera. They prosecuted that person, he was found guilty, and then London Underground put a picture of this man abusing the guard on the posters. So not only was the man who had abused the guard fined and in prison, he was also shamed because he was on the posters all over London and all over the tubes, on the trains. And more or less overnight the problem disappeared, because now everybody in London knows you abuse the guard, you're going to get prosecuted. So you can introduce controls. Workplace controls, think about going to the bank. You go to the bank, before you get to the front door, there's 2 cameras taking pictures of you. You go through the front door, there are more cameras on you and all over the place. They have someone to meet you and says, how can I help? He's trying to reduce the violence. If you want to take the money from the cashier or the teller, it's very difficult. They have security arrangements. So they've thought about it very carefully in how they manage the workplace and the work systems. So they've done a good job there to manage violence, because they're handling the public and they're handling money. So they know that they are at risk. You can train your people how to manage, deal with people who are violent, so that you can train them to be calm and polite and manage the situation well. And now think about the people that you meet at the bank. They're calm, polite, well-trained, and they talk to you nicely, because that's what they do. They're reducing the chance of violence. They've done the risk assessment and chosen a suitable person to put there. And that's a good thing. It can still happen that violence happens at work. So if it has happened, the person who has been abused, either verbally or physically, needs to debrief. They need an opportunity to talk about what has happened. And you'll want them to talk because you want to get a statement from them about what happened. So you can debrief them. Take them to a quiet place, give them a cup of tea if that's what they'd like. Say, we want to help you, we're going to look after you, we're going to support you, and take a statement. Debrief them. They may need time off work, either to get over the psychological trauma or to get over the physical damage if they've been hit. They'll probably want legal help, and as a company you may provide the legal help, as I suggested London Underground did. And then other employees may also need help. So if one employee is the victim of violence and other employees see it happen, these other employees may also be stressed because they're thinking, it happened to my colleague, it could happen to me tomorrow. So maybe they need some support as well. Okay, we'll move on now, and we're going to look at the effects of alcohol, drugs and solvents in the workplace and on people's behaviour. Well, the first thing to say is alcohol definitely produces mood changes. Sometimes it makes people feel really happy, and sometimes it makes them down and depressed. And sometimes it does both, just different times. Sometimes it produces aggression, that makes people violent, and sometimes it makes them very passive and laid back. It can cause confusion. People think they're doing a good job, well, in fact, they're not doing a good job. Their concentration levels have gone down. It can affect the amount of energy they put into work. You can either give them more energy for a short period, or you can give them less energy for a long period. It might make their doing of the job unsafe. So, for example, if someone drives a big truck on the roads and they take alcohol or drugs, you don't want them driving your trucks because they're unsafe to themselves, to your truck, and to everybody else on the roads. So there's some cases where we have jobs that are safety critical, where we do not want people to have alcohol or drugs in their systems. It may affect the person's timekeeping. They may start coming to work late or leaving early. Maybe they'll be off sick and they'll have a lot of absences. Their absentee rate goes up because they have a hangover or they're not feeling well because of the alcohol or because of the drugs. All this will affect their relationship with others. Their colleagues may or may not be happy with what they're doing. They may not be, we say, pulling their weight, not doing their share of the work. The customers may not be happy, and that's even more serious for us, because if our customers are not happy, then that's bad for our business. And they may not be happy with their management either. And all of this is difficult to manage. And then, because they are abusing, in this case, alcohol or drugs, that's an expensive habit. So there may be increased theft. So they may see somebody's purse and take money from it because they need to keep buying alcohol and drugs to serve their addiction. So control measures. Well, one is to monitor and screen. This can produce difficulties for us as a company. Do we monitor people because I think he's behaving badly? Or do we say, right, you must have a blood test for alcohol and drugs when you start? Or do we say we will randomly check people, and then who decides whose turn it is to be checked? And the last one is we can check routinely. Every week we check people. Or we can check on suspicion. So if someone's behaviour looks erratic, looks unusual, we could do a blood test and check for alcohol or drugs. But who decides whether the person is suspicious? And what happens if the person says, "Why did you pick on me? Why not him?" So we need a policy. So if we have a policy that says we're going to check on suspicion, then that policy is there, and it must apply to everybody, from the top management to the lowest grade staff. Then the policy must describe the disciplinary action. So you might have a policy that says zero tolerance. If you come to work with alcohol or drugs in your blood, you're dismissed. No chances at all. Or you might have a policy that says if you come to work and it's safety critical, you must leave, you'll be dismissed. But if you come to work and it's not safety critical, we will support you to try and get treatment to overcome this addiction. Whatever your policy is, you need to say who's going to manage and implement this policy. Is it your normal management? Is it the HR department? Is it the security department? And it must be a fair system. It must apply to everybody from top to bottom. But we need to have a policy. Just by way of digression, I'd like to say some people on medication may behave differently because they've got their medication wrong, and they're not on alcohol or drugs or solvents abusing them, they're on a medication which they need to have. So your policy must allow for that as well. So if we have it, or we think we have an alcohol or drugs problem, we need to investigate and find out whether it's just one person or whether it's quite widespread. You might find that a particular department have got a problem. Maybe because they're stressed, or because they have a culture of having a drink at lunchtime that has grown more than it should have done. We can take planning actions, and we can tell people we have a program and a policy about alcohol and drugs. So we have the policy and we communicate it. We say we're going to give training. We're going to have a confidential support line so we can help people who have an addiction to come off it and come free. So if we're taking action, then we have to have with the policy a statement. This is what you're going to do, and this is what you're going to do, and this is what your responsibilities are. And that will include confidentiality. So if I, as an employee, think that a colleague is abusing alcohol, I need to be able to report it to the correct person and know that I will be protected with confidentiality, so that person doesn't know it's me who reported them, for my well-being and safety. And then we need to understand that is it our company policy that alcohol and drugs are a gross misconduct issue as far as employment is concerned or not. So now we have the policy in place, we have the system in place, and now we have to monitor it. And we can check. We could measure attendance. Are people coming to work on time, more on time? We could screen people and see if they have drugs or alcohol in their blood systems. Okay, that's the end of the talk material. Just like to remind you that you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn and Facebook. Thank you.